Nurse Jamie was no stranger to night shifts, but something about the empty, echoing halls of St. Gertrude's hospital after midnight always unsettled her. That night, as she made her rounds on the dimly lit third floor, she heard the unmistakable sound of soft whispers behind her. Turning sharply, she found the corridor empty, save for the usual creaks and shadows. She brushed it off as her imagination and continued down the hallway, clutching her clipboard a little tighter. In room 305, she met Mrs. Calhoun, an elderly patient with dementia who'd been in and out of consciousness all day. As Jamie checked her vitals, Mrs. Calhoun's eyes suddenly widened. "He's here," she whispered. Jamie frowned, glancing around. "Who's here, Mrs. Calhoun?" The woman's gaze drifted to a corner of the room, and her mouth twisted into a terrified smile. "The man with no face," she said, her voice hollow. A chill ran down Jamie's spine. Throughout the night, Jamie tried to shake off the encounter, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She continued her rounds, but every time she passed room 305, she felt that same eerie presence. Around 3 a.m., she saw a shadow dart past the nurse's station. She followed it to a dimly lit room at the end of the hall, where the shadow vanished. But as she turned to leave, she felt a cold breath on her neck. She spun around, only to see a reflection in the glass, a man with no face standing behind her. Terrified, Jamie backed into the room and flipped on the light, but the figure was gone. She rushed back to the station, her pulse racing. She glanced at the patient charts, and her heart skipped a beat. Room 305 was empty. Mrs. Calhoun had passed away earlier that night. Had she been imagining the whole thing? But the memory of that faceless man lingered, haunting her. As dawn broke, Jamie was finishing up her shift when a coworker asked her about her night. She hesitated, not wanting to sound insane, but she mentioned the faceless man. Her coworker's face went pale. "You saw him too?" he whispered. He told her that several night shift workers had encountered a faceless figure who haunted the halls around room 305, always appearing shortly after a patient passed. Later that week, Jamie returned to the hospital, but couldn't shake the sense of dread that the faceless man was watching her. She avoided room 305 altogether, yet she could feel his presence in every shadowed corner. The whispers seemed louder, closer, as if they were calling her name. She asked for a transfer to the day shift, desperate to escape his gaze. Months later, Jamie met an older nurse who had worked in St. Gertrude's for decades. When Jamie shared her story, the older nurse nodded knowingly. She explained that years ago, a man had died in room 305, his face horribly disfigured in a car accident. Ever since, he had been seen wandering the hospital, searching for a face he could never regain. Though Jamie eventually left St. Gertrude's, she would never forget the faceless man or the empty halls that echoed his presence. And every so often, she would wake in the middle of the night, feeling that cold breath on her neck once again. She would lie awake until dawn, wondering if he had followed her home. Years later, Jamie heard of a new nurse at St. Gertrude's who had requested a shift change after encountering something disturbing on the third floor. Jamie knew without asking that the faceless man was still there, still haunting room 305, and still searching in vain for a face he could call his own. When Dr. Ethan Cooper joined St. Mary's Hospital, he had no idea about the rumors surrounding its basement. Known for its old architecture and endless hallways, The basement stored unused equipment and supplies, as well as the morgue. On his first night shift, Ethan had to go down there to retrieve some files. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors, he felt a strange, suffocating heaviness in the air. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should, and shadows danced on the walls, twisting into unsettling shapes. Ethan tried to ignore the oppressive silence, but his footsteps echoed unnaturally, almost as if someone was following him. He brushed it off, focusing on finding the storage room where the files were kept, but just as he reached the door, he heard faint, dragging footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone else, but the hall was empty. Suddenly, he noticed a dark shape out of the corner of his eye, a shadow moving on its own. It crept along the wall, stretching and shifting until it resembled a hunched figure, almost human, but twisted and wrong. Heart pounding, Ethan darted into the storage room and closed the door, trying to steady his breath. Inside, the air felt even colder, and he noticed frost forming on the metal shelves. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Ethan rummaged through the files as quickly as he could, trying to ignore the scratching sound coming from outside the door. As he reached for the last file, the light went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. A low, raspy whisper filled the room. "Get out," it hissed, each word drawn out like a painful breath. Ethan froze, clutching the file, but the whisper grew louder, angrier, desperate. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight and shined it toward the door. To his horror, the shadow figure was inside the room with him, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its hand outstretched. Ethan stumbled back, his light flickering as he backed away from the shadowy figure. He felt something cold and wet brush against his face, like an icy hand, and his skin crawled. Without another thought, he bolted out of the room and sprinted down the hallway, never looking back. He could feel the shadow chasing him, its presence suffocating, until he finally burst out of the basement and into the safety of the hospital's main floor. The next day, he asked a senior doctor about the basement, and she gave him a knowing look. She told him about an orderly who had died down there years ago, his body found in that very storage room, frozen and twisted in a way that made no sense. Ever since, strange occurrences had been reported, especially at night. The doctors believed the orderly's restless spirit haunted the basement, warning others to stay away. Ethan avoided the basement after that, but every so often, he would hear stories from other doctors and nurses, stories of shadows moving on their own, icy whispers in empty rooms, and a warning that echoed through the halls, "Get out." Paramedic Lisa Maddox had heard tales about St. Luke's Hospital, but she never believed in ghosts. That changed one rainy night when she received a call about a car accident near the hospital. She and her partner, Tony, responded immediately, expecting to transport a critical patient. But when they arrived at the scene, there was no car, no accident, and no one to be found. Confused, they radioed dispatch, only to hear a static-filled response. "Proceed to room 412." Distorted voice crackled through the speaker. The strange request unsettled Lisa, but they followed the directions and returned to the hospital. They made their way to the 4th floor, even though no one had radioed for assistance. Room 412 was dark, the bed empty, but the air felt thick with something unexplainable. Lisa noticed a patient chart on the door, The name faded and barely legible. She could just make out the date of death. October 31, 10 years ago to the day. The details sent a chill through her, but before she could react, the lights flickered, and the faint sound of a heart monitor began to beep. Tony, visibly nervous, suggested they leave, but Lisa felt compelled to stay. The monitor beeped louder, almost erratically, and she could swear she saw a shadow lying in the bed. She approached slowly, and as she got closer, the shadow shifted. Suddenly, the monitor flatlined, and the room plunged into silence. Just as they turned to leave, Lisa's radio crackled again. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost childlike, and she froze, realizing it was the same voice they had heard on the dispatch. They looked at each other, fear evident in their eyes. Lisa reached out to turn off the monitor, but the moment her hand touched it, she felt a sharp, icy pain in her chest. She gasped, feeling as if she couldn't breathe, and stumbled back. Tony caught her, pulling her out of the room as she clutched her chest, the pain subsiding only after they were in the hallway. Shaken, they hurried to the nurses' station, where they learned room 412 had been closed off years ago. No one had occupied it since the death of a young boy on Halloween night. Lisa and Tony left the hospital, haunted by the experience. They both heard stories afterward of others who had received final calls to room 412, only to encounter the spirit of the young boy, desperate for help he would never receive. Lisa would never forget that chilling voice on the radio, and she never ignored a call for help again, no matter how strange it seemed.